And now, yes, Sebastian, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me know if you can't hear me. I guess maybe you can hear me well. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. So today, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about some kind of alternative building blocks that we're using for fast reinforcement learning. And these kind of methods is not necessarily that we're beating kind of state of the art now, but it's about exploring kind of alternative representations that might be underrepresented in the current machine learning landscape, taking inspiration from different approaches from nature. And so the kind of the inspiration comes from when we look at the current trends in AI, we see like models are getting larger and larger. With you know, this is now 22 this graph, so it should be extended even further. This is an older graph, but basically model size is just increasing. The data that we need to train these models is increasing, and they do show impressive performances across different domains. On the other hand, you can still, in a lot of cases, they also show that they're still very much more brittle than our, you know, like than humans or other like kind of biological intelligence. So this is some work by others where they showed that basically these systems are very good to detect objects if they're presented in the poses that they were trained with. Then it's no problem for them to detect a school bus, a motor scooter, or a fire truck. But if you orient this in a slightly, you know, slightly or maybe more than slightly different way, then the system is very confused and recognizes this as a garbage truck, a punching bag, a snow plow. This motor scooter becomes a parachute, a bobsled, a parachute, and so on. And of course, sometimes it could be hard to detect this, but every human would still be able to detect that is a fire truck, even though it's in a slightly different pose. So these systems are still very much more brittle than you know, natural intelligence. So this doesn't only affect supervised learning methods like object recognition, but also maybe interesting for people here, and I guess you know about this also in other domains, like when you have embodied agents, you can also easily fool them, and they are not very good at reacting to things they have not seen during training. So in this case, you have how many people here have seen this example before? Okay, 1, 2. So in this case, you have a robot that is trained. So you have a goalie, and this robot is trying to shoot the ball into the goal. And this goalie discovered an interesting strategy. So normally this shooter is very good, but then it discovered an interesting adversarial strategy, and that is just throwing yourself to the ground, and then the other soccer player doesn't know what to do anymore and basically collapses. I don't know how well that will work for the current, like in the current for human soccer, but it still shows that these methods are not very good. They don't show any common sense, and can easily be fooled by out of distribution kind of information. They even show that even in simple like Atari games, you can have like world-class programs that play Atari, and then you need to only change, you know, 2-3 pixels, and these systems will also completely break down and not perform well anymore. And this is not just the case for these kind of again, like the supervised learning models or the reinforcement learning models, but also just recently this paper came out, which I thought was pretty interesting, that also shows that these large language models basically break down in even simple reasoning tasks if they were not part of the training data. So these are tasks that any kind of child would be able to perform, but these large language models with billions of parameters, they fail at this kind of very simple common sense task. So that shows there's still some fundamental difference to biological intelligence and some fundamental problems that we have to address to make these systems really robust and give them, you know, common sense and make them more kind of more adaptive. And so we're in our group, we're looking kind of inspiration from how did biological intelligence solve these issues. And we, like nature's building blocks, they, for this kind of fast learning and robustness, seem to be at least these two things. There are many other building blocks, but at least these two principles we observe in many natural systems that show a lot of like robustness and resilience. And that is, one is self-organization, that you often have simple components that together make something much more complex than the individual parts. So you have these huge termite mounds, you have ants that can collaborate building bridges. Of course, you have many cells that collaborate together to create the most complex structure known, the human brain. So this kind of self-organization is so common in nature, but it seems to be one of the really essential ingredients. And often these self-organizing systems have nice properties, like they can repair themselves, like you can, damage this termite or this dog losing its leg, but still being able to adapt and still being able to function, even though this is a situation that it didn't experience before. So these systems that are made out of many, like maybe the individual parts are not that intelligent, being it termites, ants, or cells themselves, but together they form something that is much more resilient and much more adaptive than what we currently have in deep learning. So that's one property. And the other property seems to be diversity. So it's ants take different roles depending on the situation. We have many, we don't just have one type of neuron in our brains, but we have many, many different neurons. So we have on one part, we have the self-organization, but we also have diversity in those different components that make this kind of collective intelligence. So which we explore a variety of these kind of systems that have different, where we incorporate diversity, we incorporate self-organization, and see how can we reach a similar kind of level of robustness. And so one kind of model that we use is these kind of models, self-organizational models that are built on some kind of local interaction. And the standard model for this is kind of these cellular automata, and we use variations of this. We don't use this kind of these more simple 2D systems, but just it gives you an interesting like an interesting idea of even simple rules can lead to these kind of very complex behaviors. And one, so I guess everybody here knows cell automata, I guess, where you have, you have local rules. Each cell is only looking at the local neighborhood. And oftentimes in the past, you have some rule table that defines of what should the cell do in the next step, depending on how many neighbors it has. The room has been equipped with new mics. Okay. But of course, ultimately, we don't just want to have a particular start state and then let the system, do its thing, because the rules in this system doesn't change. It's only where you place the initial elements and then you observe the dynamics. What we actually want to do is we want to learn to kind of control these self-organizing systems to grow, for example, to grow a certain type of pattern or to create certain types of dynamics. And recently there has been renewed interest in this kind of complex self-organizing systems using, for example, neural cellular automata, neural networks that define the rules of how these elements, what these elements should do. So in each one of these little components, you have a neural network running that is the same neural network, and that takes information from like the local neighborhoods and then decides what should I do next. And also we can train these systems now with differential programming, so we can have a final pattern we want the system to reach, and then we can train it through differential programming, through gradient descent. We can modify the weights of a neural network to guide it into growing into a certain type of shape. And one thing that is missing also from this kind of very simple cellular automata is there's no diversity. You have like only one cell type, but as we see later, what we have been doing is extending these systems to also incorporating different levels of diversity. And so one work I just wanted to show you, and later on I'll focus more on like how we can actually control agents, but to just show you an idea of what you can learn with these systems. So this is work we published a few years ago in this A-Life conference where we learned a neural network that controls the growth, that we train to grow different structures in Minecraft. So we learn to grow different types of trees, different types of structures. So the structures are made by a human, but what we do is we learn how to grow them only through the local interaction of cells. So all of these cells only perceive their local neighborhood, what type of cells, what type of voxels do they see, and they have to decide what type of cell should they become. And this system was able then to grow just from a static cell things like trees with many different types of blocks, but not just trees, also, let's see in the next example, also things like apartment buildings with 80 different types of blocks, for example, again, only through the local interaction. Everyone just sees their direct neighbors and needs to decide what it should become. And these cells, they see the neural networks see the state of the cells, but they also see like some hidden channels. So they can learn to do communication and learn to figure out what kind of signals do they need to communicate from one part of the structure to the other. And then it can also grow, because it's Minecraft, you can also grow structures that are actuated, like this salamander, for example, because you have these redstone components that can do actuation. And then we can, showing the resilience of the system, we can cut it in half, and it's able to kind of recover from that damage, again, only by seeing its local neighbors. So this was kind of to give you an idea of what these self-organization systems can do and what we can train them to do. And based on these ideas of self-organization and diversity, I want to kind of talk about three different works that we did that kind of challenge different assumptions in current reinforcement learning. So oftentimes what we see is that we have fixed weights during deployment. So we train most of the work, either be it neural evolution or be it reinforcement learning. We train these architectures and we freeze the weights, and then we put our system into deployment. But while it's running, it's not changing its weight anymore, which is very different to biological neural networks that change your brain all the time, not just during like a specific dedicated learning period. So this is one thing we wanted to investigate. Can we have systems that constantly change their weight based on that self-organize their weights during deployment? Oftentimes, the second point, same activation function in the whole network. So oftentimes we have, the whole network has the same activation function. Maybe we have some different ones at the outputs, but oftentimes we have maybe 10H or ReLU or whatever you might have it, but it's oftentimes the same one. Whereas in biological systems, you have a great diversity of different dynamics of neurons. So the idea was, what can we do with having more diverse activation functions that are learned, and what can they do by themselves without us training anything about the parameters of the network? What if we only train diversity of activation functions? And then the last part is that we are very used to having fixed architecture. So even though you have architecture search, that during deployment you normally don't change anything about your architecture. So what if we allow the architecture to grow and change, more similar to biological nervous systems that also change during the lifetime of the individual? And starting with the first work, fixed weights during deployment, I wanted to show some work we did. We had at NeurIPS a few years ago. So this is a standard. Here's a visualization of a standard, the weights of a neural network. And what happens if we put it to control an ant. And as we see, if we have this network, a standard fixed weight network controlling an ant, it doesn't have any problem controlling an ant that is as seen during training. But when we damage the ant to something it hasn't seen, then we'll see that it's not able to adapt to this change. So it's fine working with the morphology it's seen. It's fine working with the damaged morphology it has seen. But once we damage it in a manner it hasn't seen during training, it's not very robust and basically fails. So the approach that we developed, which building on earlier work with Hebbian learning and evolution and work that was done by Floriano many years ago, what we basically said, what happens if we don't train the weights at all? So every time the agent is put in an environment, it starts with completely random weights. And the only thing we learn is local learning rules. So we're not using any reinforcement learning. We're only training the system using local learning rules. Local meaning that the weight update between like two neurons only happens based on the activation of the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic, the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. And then we have different constants that we evolve that are different. We evolve those per connection on a connection basis. And then this formula, what's called this Hebbian, generalized Hebbian learning rule, defines the weight change at each time step is depending only on the activity of the pre and postsynaptic node and those parameters that we evolve. So that's the only thing we learn. So instead of learning one parameter per connection, which is the weight, we're not learning the weight, but we're learning these additional, these other 5 parameters, A, B, C, D. So we're increasing a little bit the space that we search through. But if that gives you more robustness, then maybe it's useful to do that. And so starting from, and it's a little bit because it's quite fast, but starting from completely random weights, which you see in the middle here, the system is quickly able to kind of self-organize its weights, so able to control all the morphologies it has seen during training, but also the last one you see here, it's also able to work on a morphology that it has not seen during the training. And it's not that it reaches the best performance with this morphology, but it's better able to deal with it than the static network you see on the right side. And you can notice that this weight change never stops. It's not that the weights reach a certain point, but it reaches some kind of attractor where the weights of the network going through this attractor states, but still changing the whole time while the agent is in this environment. So you have an agent that we're kind of I wouldn't maybe call it learning, but adaptation maybe never stops, which could have interesting applications for also like continual learning tasks where you have to train the agent to do more than one thing at a time. And also, yeah, please disrupt me interrupt me if you have any questions while I present. Otherwise, I'm also happy to take questions later. But and then we also applied this to our real environment, and as you can see, again on the right side here, you have a network that never stops while the agent is interacting with the environment. And then you can also do some interesting experiments. So you can not only cut off like limbs of this agent and see how it reacts, but we can also do some kind of brain surgery. And what we did here is we removed all of these weights in one of the fully connected layers. So we replaced them all with zeros, which led to a sharp decrease in performance. But then we can see a few time steps later, the robot recovered performance, and it was able to just do these local learning rules again, to even from completely random zeroed out weights to recover. It's a slightly different weight matrices that it was before, but it was still able to create a matrix that was able to, that the robot could locomote. And one thing to note here is all of these experiments, that we don't give any reward during the lifetime of the agent. So we train these local rules, we simulate the agent, and we give it a fitness based on how well it did. But it does not get any reward during its lifetime. if that makes sense. Otherwise, let me know and I'll try to explain it more.
Yeah. They're asking online, is it necessary to get dynamic weights through Hebbian rule?
Like necessary in, okay, that's also.
Specify.
I mean, you couldn't, I mean, there are other approaches to this kind of more like the work that you guys do here, where you use, map leads to find compensatory behaviors if damage occurs. But this is kind of one maybe complementary approach to that seems to work, that is more resilient than having like a fixed weight setup. I mean, so you don't need them depending on your task, but it looks like it has some benefits to static networks. Of course, you can also do, people have done similar things also with LSTMs, which is, so this is, in this case, you have kind of adaptation in the weight space. You can also, of course, have adaptation during the lifetime through changes in your, like a recurrent network or an LSTM, which also allows you to adapt to changes. Interestingly, we have, so this is work we submitted to IROS. We don't know yet if it's accepted, I think, but where we try to transfer, or we transferred the results of this to like a real physical robot that we trained also with Hebbian learning. So in this robot, which is inspired by the dung beetle, which can, the idea is that you have a robot that can not only use its limbs to locomote, but also to manipulate kind of objects. And interestingly, one thing that surprised me, in this task, in one of the tasks, we actually got better performance. So when we have this the object transportation task, we see that the LSTM is actually, it's better than the Hebbian one. But in case of adapting to the real world, for locomotion, we actually seen that the Hebbian, and I forgot to include those graphs, we actually see that for locomotion, the Hebbian one had a much better performance to doing the real world transfer. So we only trained in simulation and then transferred to the real world, and the Hebbian version transferred better to the real world than in LSTM, which was kind of surprising, because the standard would be to use an LSTM network, but it seems that the Hebbian one is also very good at crossing kind of this reality gap, maybe because it starts out with these random weights, and then it doesn't overfit so much to the environment. But for real world transfer, the Hebbian approach seems to work surprisingly well. So this kind of leading to the second point. So we have seen that we can train, we can have completely random weights, and they're self-organized in only a few time steps, and not requiring 10,000 of time steps like many current reinforcement learning algorithms, by training in this kind of meta loop where you're finding these learning rules and then you put the system into an environment. The other thing we're interested in is, does it help to have different types of activation functions in a network? So every node can learn its own kind of activation functions and recurrent dynamics, and again, trying to start with completely keeping the weights completely random. So in this setup, the weights are completely random, they don't change, but we have recurrent units that learn different activation functions, and that's the only way the network is able to learn. And this is kind of, again, inspired by that in real brains, nervous systems, we see a lot of neural diversity, so a lot of different cell types with different dynamics and characteristics, while in our standard neural network architectures, we have all sigmoids, maybe sometimes maybe different activation functions in the inputs and outputs, but it's quite uniform. So in this case, we're interested in, if we if we keep the weights random, so we initialize this network completely randomly, and the only thing we allow is these recurrent neurons that take into account their current state and the previous state and the input, and then we learn a matrix that allows us to take that information into account to produce the output. So it's a simple kind of recurrent unit that can basically learn its kind of own that can learn its own activation function, which is not only influenced by what's coming in, but also the previous state of the node. And interestingly, what we found is that these networks, so here on the, again, as a comparison, here on the left side is a standard neural network where what is trainable is the red parameters and the green parameters are fixed. And on the other side, this neural diversity network, we have what's trainable is the red, the activation functions, and the green connections are fixed but random and don't change during the lifetime of the individual. And in both instances, we can see that the system was able to come up with a policy that can solve different types of reinforcement tasks, like navigating this car from pixels alone. And also, again, this task is a task where the environments are procedurally generated. So it's every time the agent is confronted with this, it's slightly different to the track. So you actually have to learn to drive resiliently. And if we then look at the neurons in one neural network, then we can see that they do show a lot of different diversity in how they react to the inputs into the system. So in blue, we can see the activation. So this is kind of the what comes in and what comes out. And in orange, which is maybe a little hard to see, we could see the current neural state, the kind of the memory state of the neuron. And we see that it discovered a lot of like different activation functions. Some look more like, you know, the typical sign functions. Some look like step functions. Some have a little bit of repetition, like a sign function. And so they discovered a great kind of diversity of things that somehow work together in making this network perform, even though the weights it has are fixed but random. And then you can see sometimes there's a lot of, in this cases, why it's orange, you can see that the neural state is changing a lot with the activation of the network. That's why this whole thing is colored in orange. So sometimes you just see a single line, and sometimes you see, because it's changing so fast, it's painting the whole thing orange. So you get some of these neurons show very interesting kind of trajectories and dynamics that the system discovered itself. So in this case, we use similarly to the previous one, where we trained just the Hebbian rules. We use an evolutionary strategy. Maybe I should have mentioned that before. We use an evolutionary strategy to optimize these parameters. And then so then you get scores that are kind of, you know, competitive with other methods, sometimes even outperforming other methods. So in this case, our scores is the recurrent neuron. We also compared that to simple neurons that do not get any previous state information. We compared it to small feed-forward neural networks. And we also compared it to the weight-agnostic neural network work. And you can see here that in some cases, it's like in the case of the car racing, the recurrent neuron one performs very competitively. And in some instances, they reach kind of similar performance. Again, so the recurrent ones in the simple neuron is the one where we don't train any weight parameters compared to the small and the small and same feed-forward one where we do train this, which is the standard way of training, basically. and comparing across these three domains: card pole, the bipedal walker, and kart racing. So these kind of results show that you can get similar performance, but training a completely separate part of that we maybe don't so often think about when we think about training neural networks. Most of the time, we're just thinking about training weight parameters. So this opens up a little bit of a different perspective. And coming to the kind of the last point is we're also exploring ways of that we are not only having fixed architectures, but that we actually have architectures that grow during the development of the network, but also that can still change, that are more flexible during the deployment. So maybe if you discover that you need additional functionality, you can grow additional layers, you can grow additional capacity. We're not quite there yet, but we're taking steps in that direction. And so this is a project that we are exploring as part of this ERC project, Grow AI, with this team, where basically the whole idea is we have what we call a Neural Developmental Program, which is basically a neural network that runs in each cell of a policy network that controls, for example, an agent or a robot. So you can imagine that it's kind of like a graph neural network, and this policy this neural development program decides when should this network grow, when should this network change, when should it adapt connections. So this is the program that guides and controls kind of the self-organization and the developmental growth of this other network. So in this case, it's a particular type of indirect encoding that we use. And the idea is that by having this kind of compression, because this neural network can be very small, but still control the growth of a much larger and more complex network. And there is some hypothesis out there that this kind of genomic bottleneck would lead to more generalization. So the idea and the hope is that these systems will be better at dealing with situations they have not seen during training, because there is this kind of compression of neural wiring and also of adaptation rules. So this is kind of in contrast to the current trend where you have large number of parameters, larger and larger, but the ability to generalize maybe not so high. But then on the biological side, we have a much smaller number of parameters. And when I talk about parameters, I mean the trainable parameters. The trainable parameters is like the genome that's much smaller than the final phenotype, which is the actual brain. But it has to go through this genomic bottleneck, and that is hypothesized to lead to this higher level of generalization. And so before I present some of our initial results, there's some related works that maybe you have heard about, hyperneat, hypernetworks. But the one thing that these kind of approaches skip, they also describe a network through compression. And also now these approaches becoming more popular with, for example, these fine-tuning language models. You have also these low-rank LoRa methods, low-rank matrix multiplication. What all of these methods kind of skip is that they're not going through a process of development and growth. They're creating the whole network structure in kind of one shot. And so what we're interested in this kind of Grow AI project is growth essential, like growing a neural network, like we grow, like biological nervous systems grow. What kind of benefits, what kind of advantages could that have? And so that's what we're currently exploring. And so yeah.
So if growing is good, and you say sometimes, okay, I'm facing something complicated, I need a network to grow. One question will be, are you also looking at that sometimes it's good to shrink the network? Because if not, the answer could be just start bigger already.
Right. Yeah, so these methods that we're making, they can decide to add layers or nodes, but they can also decide to remove them. So we kind of want to like see what is the advantage. Like it could also be, I mean, there's this whole field of the lottery ticket hypothesis, right? That says you can just start large. So it would be very interesting to comparing these approaches against methods that start large and pruning, whether starting small and growing. So I could see different, maybe it's domain dependent even what is better for certain tasks. It is also like in biological systems, you often at the start of life, you have this overproliferation of nodes, and then you have this pruning phases, and then you have maybe growth again. So it could also discover these kind of dynamics. That's the hope, that it could discover them as well. So we published first results in this neural developmental program work last year at A-Life, where, so the basic idea is that, as I said, like we have this kind of graph that is growing, developing, and in each of these nodes you have a network, the same network that does like a graph, you know, convolution, taking into account information from the neighbors and then updating its state. So every neuron is looking at the neighbors, updating its state. Then you have another multi-layer perceptron that looks at the information, and basically, based on that information, it says, oh, I want to add another node to the network. And then it's, for example, added nodes here. And then you have yet another network that predicts the weights of those connections. So every time step, basically, you query this network with the hidden state of two node pairs to say how much should that connection change. And in this first version that I'm showing you now, there's only change during a developmental phase. So you let the networks grow, then you fix them, then you put them in an environment, you see how well they perform, and that is the fitness that you use to update the next kind of time step. But then yet in another version I show you later, we actually have changes also during the lifetime of the agent. But in this case, it's just, as I said, we start with this initial graph. Then we do the graph convolution. We decide on the growth, and we predict the weights for the next time step. And that fitness is what we use to. Then we let it grow. We put it in the environment. And all of these networks together is what we call basically this kind of neural developmental program. And yeah, so to summarize, we evolved the weights of these the smaller network. We let the network grow for a certain number of time steps. We evaluate the grown network on a specific task, like how good is it controlling a cart pole or an ant robot. We give that reward performance. This is the fitness we use for our black box optimizer evolutionary strategy to update these weights. And then what we see is that we can actually grow. We can learn to grow networks for different tasks, like for example, the lunar lander. Or we can grow networks for things like half cheetah. So the network is grown. We put it in an environment. We see how well it works. And it does discover networks that are able to perform pretty well, even for like a smaller version of MNIST, like a scaled down version, because these networks have challenges if there are too many inputs. It was able to grow a network that is able to do well in MNIST classification. So we have both a version that is trainable through evolutionary strategy, but also a differentiable version that we use to train the MNIST example. Yeah, this is kind of just the training curves. And it was also interesting that we can not only get them to solve certain tasks, but we can also get them to grow a particular type of network. So like we wanted to see, can we use them to grow like networks that we often see in biological networks. And one is this kind of idea of having a small world network. So small world meaning that you have a lot of clusters, and there's a path between, there's a shortest path, or the path is short between all of these different clusters. So you kind of get these hubs. So you can basically, what it means, you can propagate information from one part of the network to another part in very few steps. So the internet has a small world architecture. Our brains have a small world architecture. Many biological networks have this kind of small world architecture, and the system was also able to do that if that's what we rewarded the system to grow. So it can kind of replicate some of the patterns that we're interested in. Now we need to explore, can it also replicate more complex kind of neural motives? In another extension to this that we had accepted as a poster paper at this year's Gecko is that we can get the system to work better if we also again introduce diversity into the mix. So oftentimes with the previous version I showed you, had the problems of sometimes the whole system would not grow at all, or it would overgrow a homogeneous network where all the nodes basically are the same state. So that's one issue with these self-organizing systems, that they can be hard to control. And one thing that helps here is if we use, basically we introduce two mechanisms that we give each node its own intrinsic state. So we make the nodes different from the start. And then we added this mechanism of lateral inhibition. That means that a node, when a node grows, it inhibits some of the other nodes into also growing for some time. And by introducing these kind of mechanisms, which are also inspired by biological mechanisms, the system was able to work better on tasks like the ant, the pendulum reacher, and so on. So here you can see this is the vanilla NDP, like the vanilla Neural Developmental Program, and orange is the version where we added neural diversity, and it works much better across the board than some other tasks. And you also see that a standard hypernetwork works quite similar, oftentimes also better. So one thing we need to figure out, kind of what are these. So in this sense, it's not essential to have growth here. You get similar performance, maybe a little worse performance. So we need to figure out kind of what tasks, in what situations could this be useful. So one thing that is interesting, which some other methods have a harder time with, is this lifetime learning. So if you change something about the environment, that you cannot, there's no time to re-evolve your controller, then that's something where this kind of these developmental programs or other forms of learning can help. And so the next step, what we did now, which we have now accepted at ALive, is where we take into account also at each time step, basically, it's also taken into account the reward from the environment to change something about its connectivity. So it can add a new node during the lifetime, it can change the connection between nodes, and that is a new mechanism that we now incorporated. And interestingly, it works. So if you look at this kind of the ability to incorporate something, change your behavior during the lifetime, it doesn't help you much on things like a card poll. So the blue line is the lifetime learning one, and the red one is the traditional neural developmental program. So there you don't have much gain from being able to adapt, online, because it's a stationary reward. So you can just be born with a policy that allows you to control card poll. But there are other tasks where you actually have to learn during the lifetime of the agent. For example, in this very simple foraging task, sometimes you have food on the right side and sometimes you have food on the left side. So you start out in the middle. You have to navigate to one arm of this, one-dimensional line. And if you notice there's no reward there, you get put back to the start, and then you have to remember that last time you went to the right or the left side, and you have to change your behavior accordingly. So this task does require, because you're not getting this as additional information as an input, it does require the agent either to learn through its activations, like an LSTM, or it has to change the weight pattern. It has to change something about the weights. And in this case, which is kind of, this task is kind of inspired by classical tasks from like cognitive experience with animals, like this T-maze task. And in this case, we can see a clear advantage of the lifetime learning NDP, the blue line here, compared to the red line. So a standard feed-forward network without any recurrent connections or plasticity is not able to solve this task. You need something that changes. In this case, there's a clear advantage compared to the original NDP model that we developed. So we have seen that kind of incorporating some of these alternative building blocks can enable, in some cases, more robust agents, like in the case of the ant robot. But it also shows that we can create these agents in different ways than maybe what we're used to. And so one important question is kind of what features are we missing that could make our system perform better? Which type of things should we combine to get the best synergies? Specific to Grow AI, is this kind of growth development, is it essential? Like in biological intelligence, our brains all go through a process of growth, but maybe it's just a byproduct of nature. Maybe we don't need it. So that's one thing we wanted to try to find out. And then the other thing is, how does the environment affect neural development? So in more complex environments, would we evolve more complex neural structures, neural architectures, or so how does the maybe changing something about the environment, how does that affect this neural connectivity? And so that's also points the way to the next kind of step. So we have these neural developmental programs, but we have only applied them to very kind of simple environments. And so the next step is to combine this work with ideas from procedurally generating environments, unsupervised environment design, maybe using something like the work that we did, the Mari GPT, or the work that just came out of this lab, like OmniEpic, where you have a method that can create you a very diverse environment. So now it would be really interesting to combine them to kind of co-evolve both the architectures, but also the environments at the same time, kind of providing a scaffold to learning more and more complex things. So that would be really interesting to try this combination. And so that was basically it. Thank you very much for your attention. Also, we are, if you're interested in this kind of Grow AI work, that we're currently hiring on that as well. And also then I wanted to make commercial for this A-Life conference. So if you haven't heard about it, it's happening soon, next month in Copenhagen. It's this similar work here, work on self-organization, collective intelligence, many other interesting work. So see if you can attend. Would be nice to see you there. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Still a few extra questions. There's still line of comment from similar things. He said only it's icon, but says I don't think each weight might be beforehand. The neural network should evolve according to the model or function area. It's a comment that the person is reflecting into.
Yeah. So one thing we're exploring now is also that we taken ideas that we actually going back to things like Hyperneat, that we actually give nodes location in space, and then it could actually, depending on those locations, it could actually develop, you know, different types of plasticity or decide to react differently to stimuli, for example. So that's definitely something that we are interested in exploring. To how much would it add to the system?
Not actually have one from, well, you can start. So there was one thing that you said in the first part about the you have a business function instead of the reward function. But I was wondering, how is that really different from having just a reward function at the end of the whole episode, right? Like, it would be equivalent to this fitness function.
Yeah. So the thing is that during, like, for example, the robot that needs to adapt where we cut off a leg, that robot does not get any information that the leg is missing.
Okay.
So the only thing we train it on some example morphologies, right? And then when something gets cut off, then it's only based on the inputs the robot get, which is just its sensors, right? But there's no sensor that tells it now you're damaged or you got less reward than you had before. So it's all driven based on these nodes communicating with each other and figuring out kind of what's going on.
But still, you were mentioning there was a fitness function saying at the end.
Yeah, so the fitness function is not used during the lifetime. Okay. So the fitness function, we learn specific these ABCD parameters, right, for every connection. We have a specific set. We put the robot in the environment, we let it do its thing, test it on 3 different tasks, and that's the fitness we use to come up with the next set of Hebbian parameters. But during the lifetime, there is no change of these Hebbian parameters.
Yeah,
so the robot has to figure out, just based on only the sensory signals it's getting, needs to figure out, okay, I need to change my weights. That makes sense. But there's no input to the network that is the reward. And the Hebbian rules are not aware of the reward either. Yep.
Great talk. Which is a very interesting point. So I definitely buy inspiration of the growth of neural networks and so on, especially of development and infants. But one observation we also made in the instance is that actually the sensory motor system also broke. So for instance, at the very early stage, the vision of babies is extremely blurred, very low resolution in the sense. So did you also consider investigating the growth of the perception system, the motor systems, or do you think that your system is already doing this at the one stage?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to add. We have work done in like a lot of these virtual creatures where you also develop the morphology of the robot. So it would be really interesting to combine these two. But I feel like it's probably maybe it wouldn't be the next step, but maybe the step after. Because right now we're still trying to get this thing to work well, I think. But once it works well, it would be really interesting to combine it with the morphology, the visual system, but it could also be that I don't know, as a kid, when you fall, you don't fall so far, right? Because you're not so high. And so as you grow, so that would be really interesting to have kind of both and how they scaffold both on each other. But yeah. But the one challenge also with this is it's already pretty expensive, because like we need to simulate, we have the outer loop is evolution, and then the inner loop, then we have this developmental phase, and then we have a lifetime learning phase. So we have like a lot of like loops and these networks that grow. It's so that's one thing that we need to figure out how to make that very efficient, so that we can run it at a large enough scale. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions in mind. Alex asks, to what extent do you think avian learning rules, example, predictive coding, will phase out backpropagation?
Yeah, I think if you have targets, then it's always then you would of course use backpropagation, and also it doesn't mean that you can use backpropagation to train your Hebbian rules, for example, as well. So there's interesting work that came out of also UBI labs back in the day, where they backpropamine or something, where they trained Hebbian rules with backpropagation. So you can also synergistically combine those two things. But I think in contrast to just pure backpropagation, it's just faster. Once you meta-train the system, it's much faster to adapt than if you have to run backpropagation, basically.
Second question online is from iPhone. The current work seems to be focused on game tasks. Will it be applied to computer vision or NLP?
Yeah, so actually with this work I just mentioned, where they did train Hebbian rules through backpropagation, they actually tried it on an NLP task, and it seems to work also well. It didn't work, I don't think it beat any state of the art, but it worked also as well as the other methods at the time. So you can definitely extend it to NLP tasks. And also the original work by David Heinz Schmidhuber on hyper networks, they showed also that it can be useful for things like pattern recognition, for example, that you have like a more dynamic version. So I do think you could scale this also to other tasks, but we haven't explored that much. No.
All right, so I think we can finish here now. It was a very nice talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks again for the invite.
Our pleasure. So for people in person, now we're gonna have some food. It is no next all time yet. We'll be back after the summer. Thank you very much for coming.